The more I see this, the more I realize that you actually should be more cocky. You should be more like forward with the things that you've done, and they take you more seriously because of it.
What is good, everybody? This is Michael Sikand. I'm joined by my co-host and co-founder, the one and only Simran Sandhu, and this is Our Future Podcast. This is the #1 show for young entrepreneurs. We study the best and brightest in their early 20s that are building massive companies, and then we export out their insights, strategies, and business models so that you can download them for yourself and apply them to the business and ventures that you're building. So today we have some really crazy stories to tell you guys. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and make sure to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or on any of the podcasting platforms. And I'll let Simmy say a few words before we kick this episode off.
You got it, man. And you know you're going to have to tease out these founders a little bit. We've been getting some feedback as of recent. They're saying, Mike, Simmy, why are you guys covering so many MarTech founders, so many sales tech founders? And so, you know, like the advice they always give, which is go where the money is. That is what we are doing. And so we're covering people in healthcare and fintech. I can't think of any more lucrative industry than those two.
Yeah, we'll follow the money. And in this case, Hypercard is a company being built by two early 20s guys. The first is Niko, Ioannou, and the second is Marc, Baghadjian. And they are building the first ever credit card to be backed by your employer. So the story is pretty wild. So Niko was in high school, drops out, and builds a healthcare company and sells it to Galileo when he was 17 years old. And Galileo is a venture-backed health tech company. I think its secondaries are in the hundreds of millions if it's valued at, I think it's valued at
It's a multi-billion-dollar company.
Yeah, so that's just insane that he did that when he was 17 years old. So yeah, we're getting into prodigy territory. And then we have Marc Baghadjian, who is a friend of me and Simmy's, more so than Niko. We've known him longer. And he is the silver-tongued Adam Newman in a 23-year-old, 24-year-old's body. So Marc, his venture before Hypercard was building a Gen Z dating app called Lolly. And he raised a bunch of money for it, had some flashy investors. He cold emailed the former CEO of Apple, John Sculley, from his dorm room and got him to invest. And while that company didn't exactly pan out or end in an acquisition, he's now kind of put all of his eggs in this new basket with Hypercard. So yeah, I mean, the guys have some phenomenal backstories. They're both super impressive entrepreneurs, really, really versed for their age. It's very unlikely that two, early 20s guys are second-time founders, having been through the venture route, having been through acquisitions and deals and such. So, I mean, these guys are really well equipped. And it seems that they were very intentional about going after a really, really big opportunity. And I feel like fintech is an industry where you can actually shoot for the moon,
Totally. And I think they're playing to their strengths. Like when I think about Marc, I think his biggest superpower, honestly, is bringing like the magic, the energy to any concept he's working on, right? Like he knows how to bring that flair to it. And so I feel like you could stick him in like B2B accounting and he'll find a way to make it fun and energizing and buzzy. On the other side, again, I haven't had too much interactions with Niko himself, but I get the vibe that, he's very like nitty gritty, challenge focused. Like with him, it's like bring a hard problem and he'll find a way to come up with a solution. So I think together, they have a really unique dynamic relationship. And it's really interesting with what they're doing because from what I gather, it's like this converging of employer-based and consumer-based credit cards. Is that how you understand it as well?
Well, there's no such thing as an employer-based credit card, right? That's what they're reinventing with Hypercard. For the first time ever, the issuer technically is coming from the company you work for. And the real value they saw was intertwining benefits the company already offers with the benefits that your company can pay for when subscribing to the Hypercard system, right? So instead of you personally needing to foot the $700 a year Amex Platinum bill, your company will do it for you. And that's kind of awesome, right? I would completely, use a card like this if it got me that lounge access, for example, and my morning brew was paying for it. It'd be sweet, right? We love perks. We love benefits out here. They're doing something for the people. But to give a little bit more overview, the company's raised 15 million to date in a mixture of debt and equity. Sam Altman is the leading investor, and that speaks to the magic that these guys are able to bring, because not only did they get the world's biggest CEO in the world on their cap table, they got American Express to partner with them on this card. And with credit cards, it's all about prestige, right? You got to tap into the name brand, right? You got to like siphon off some of that brand loyalty. And they were able to do that by becoming an Amex network card. So they do have the logo, and they are using the Amex like financial processing, and it's the same thing. You got your security codes on the front instead of the back. It's kind of a flex.
And that's one of the most interesting things, right? Like, there's not that many cards in the Amex network. Is that right?
I don't even know how many cards there are in there. I know there's a few, but I've never seen one other than Hypercard to this date.
I think it's great, though. I think if you're trying to build a prestige-based credit card where you want to, essentially partner with someone who has prestige, it gives off this vibe of luxury. Like, there's probably not a better partner than American Express. And I think the story of how they got in front of American Express is also just as funny and entertaining in itself. I think it was like a club owner in Miami, and it's like the famous Club 11. They had some relationship or some way that they knew the CEO of Amex or one of the higher up people, and that was their foot in the door. And I was just like, that is the most Marc Baghadjian story.
Why does the owner of a strip club know the CEO of Amex? I feel like this is like a controversy waiting to happen.
I don't know if it was the CEO or what their relationship was. I think the guy who owns 11 is like a big real estate developer. So he's probably, also just like a big business guy. Probably does a lot of work with the bank.
I'm envisioning a Bloomberg Businessweek Instagram post. It's like a child prodigy, a disgraced founder, and a strip club owner blow up an Amex scandal.
Well, yeah, man. I think it's a cool card. So tell me a little bit more about it. Like, so what kind of perks do people get, and what was their opening into this market?
Yeah, I mean, the perks that people get are like a lot of the stuff through Amex. So like, for example, their Centurion lounges, their airport lounges, they get the reservation and dining network through Amex, which is an awesome kind of integration. And then a bunch of other deals, right? Like all these kind of credit card companies work with these off the shelf like benefits providers, which like give discounts on all sorts of things. So, whether it's exercise classes or rideshare or, shopping at, Lululemon, right? You get all of those things in the back, but then you get to integrate them with what your company already offers, right? So, whether your company has like a fitness stipend or, a little work from home stipend, you can then integrate that with the card. And that brings me to the next major point, in that a disruptive part of this particular card is that when you're using it on a work-related expense or something your company will cover, you can automatically expense. So no more getting a receipt or printing out a PDF invoice, submitting it to accounting with one click. It can be recognized as a transaction the company has the authority to cover, and you simply can get the points, and you don't need to hold a balance or wait 30 days to get reimbursed by your company if you pay for something, which I think is really cool.
Got it. So what it sounds like is you get all the perks that you would get from having a credit card sponsored by your employer, right? Like the flashy benefits of an Amex, but at the same time, you can still use it for like your personal expenses, right? So if I want to go fill up gas on my car, I could still use this employer branded credit card. What do you think that will be like on, at mass scale? Do you think people will be excited to use like, a credit card with Lyft on the front of it, or like whatever their company is, a Morning Brew based credit card?
Yeah, I think it would be kind of sick, right? Like, I don't know. I think Lyft and Morning Brew are good examples. I think better examples are like Google or Facebook or SpaceX, right? Where it's really hard to get into those firms, and they really confer a lot of status for working there. I think for companies like that, it would be pretty sweet to like pull out a big heavy metal card with like Google on it, right?
Yeah. I think, as you're talking here, it makes me think there's probably 4 or 5 things that you have to nail to build, say, a winning credit card in this day and age, right? You have to figure out how to get status right? So it's got to be a flashy credit card. What can make you feel better or look better compared to having any other credit card in your wallet? You have to get the perks right? So the incentives have to make sense. You also have to figure out cost, or you have to win on transactions, right? So it has to be some more advantageous cost structure than using other credit cards in your wallet. And there's probably one or two other things. I think you could probably win
Cost of acquisition.
cost per acquisition. I also think it's like, okay, this is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because the best parallel for what they have is probably like your Amex Platinum, right? So it's a $700 card. If you're telling me I can get that for free with all of the perks that a Platinum would offer, well, now they've also won based on integrations in those perks, right? You have to be able to wrap that all in one. You have to be able to offer more than anyone else out there to truly win. And I think once you do win, once it does become the main credit card that they're using on every single transactions, now it's a sticky customer. For example, I have the Apple card. I have a few of these other ones too, but the Apple card. And the reason why I got it was just because I thought it was a cool card, right? It was like Goldman Sachs and Apple. It was a little flashy. It's a white credit card. It, stainless steel, bangs on the table. That's all cool. That's all fun. But is it actually the best credit card? I probably would say no. You would probably get more cash back. You'd probably get better perks elsewhere. But I think the reason why there's an allure to it is outside of the status stuff, all of my expenses are within the Apple, within the iPhone, and I can see it all in one place, right? Every single thing that I'm using the card on, how much money I've spent. So that expense management for me personally has been huge. I know exactly where my money is going across various categories. And so I think if they can wrap that all in together and it's like, this is an all-in-one card, that's a pretty compelling pitch.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think the all-in-one aspect to it is really important. What I don't know is if people are going to want to use a credit card that is given to them by their employer. I think what Marc and Niko have said is it's all, the companies can't access the transaction data. But are you really going to run your company card on a adult website subscription? You wouldn't really want to do that.
It's interesting. I think you almost have to take a step back and look at it from what's in it for the American Express, right? So almost like the sponsor for this card. And then what is in it for the employer, right? So why wouldn't an Amex be interested in this is a good question, right? And I think it goes back to the fact that there is a small percentage of people at a company who actually have their employer cards, right? And are actively using them. I think I saw something where it was 10 to 15% of the people at a company actually have access to an employer card.
Yes,
American Express would want that number to be 100%. They want everybody at the company using that card. The question for the employer then is, can they be trusted to use their card, right? At the end of the day, more cards means more expenses. And then on top of it, it becomes a huge liability issue. Right. So if you can then go to the employer and say, hey, we have a way to track all of these expenses in a better way, better than Amex by themselves can do it. And we can hold people responsible. And the way that we can hold people responsible is that for some of the things that they would typically try to, I'm not going to say use it in a malicious way, but maybe they're trying to use those cards to tap in those perks. If we can just offer them for free, it kind of deters them from trying to use it in places that they shouldn't be. Or the other way to look at it is if we can just integrate it with, hey, these are things that they could spend for their personal lives, it becomes less of a risk for the employer. So that's what I think makes it so compelling on both sides of the equation here.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that also it's these people are always going to pay off their balance, at least for certain expenses, because the company's covering it, right? The company is effectively an insurer in that case, and they're an awesome partner for an Amex, right? To go through a company instead of a private individual.
How do you think this extends? I'm curious about that, right? So is this supposed to drive the bond closer between the employee and the employer, right? If they're getting this kind of visibility into where you're spending your money, and what are the things that you're interested in, this probably brings in really interesting data for them as well. I don't know if they have exposure to this information or what the privacy aspect here is. What does that layer look like? But I'd be curious, for them, it probably goes beyond just the money side. What else makes this compelling for an employer?
I think it's a huge play on employee satisfaction. I think there's this clan-like gene inside of us all humans that we're signaling that we're part of this greater community. That's the status side of the card. That's the metal Google card, right? There's that. when you're facing into the public outside of your firm. And then there's also just being able to access things that you don't have to pay for, right? Like that's the best part about working for a big company is at Google, for example, it's the massages and the dog they bring over to you and, the sushi chef from Japan, right? All those things are awesome. Everybody wants more company benefits. This is the issue though. Nobody uses their company benefits. I'd say there's I haven't looked into the data, but I would say there's a big fat percentage of company benefits that aren't used. We got to think about things like HSA accounts, right? Some people have an HSA card that could be integrated into the Hypercard, right? That's an employer-backed health-related spending card that comes from, pre-tax earnings. Nobody, they could involve some 401k advance, like with Lendtree, like we just covered, right? There's so much they can become. Right? There's like many different products they can get into. And I think the corporate benefit space, the big problem is there just isn't that like sticky product that makes it easy to adopt these things your company offers you.
I think there's an education issue too, though. There's an education
issue.
Yeah.
Huge education issue. Like I was thinking about, I think we talked about this on a recent episode, but like a large language model to help you just understand the benefits of your company and all the dental plans, all the healthcare plans offered, right? Just like in plain English, please tell me what's going to be the best for me. So yeah, I think there's a huge problem there. And I think if it could just be consumerized through the Hypercard, people could actually take advantage of a lot of the shit the company gives them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I also want to highlight how these guys got together, right? So, I think it's kind of serendipitous timing, which is, Niko's coming off the sale of his first company. Marc is also looking for his next big opportunity. And I love the story of how they got together. I think they had initially known about each other through this thing called Z Fellows. And it's started by this guy named Corey Levy. But I find that those co-founder stories so interesting sometimes. It's like, what is that common thread that pulls people together? Because if you were to look about it, their trajectories are so different, right? Like Niko's in healthcare, Marc was in the consumer world. Like on paper, they have no business being in a relationship together, starting a company. But on
paper, but they were both kind of wonderkins, right? Like Marc having as big of a profile as he did, getting covered in all those outlets for the dating app and having his buzzy of investors and such. I mean, I credit so much of Marc's mentality around being a young entrepreneur to what ended up happening with our future. I mean, conversations with him were what propelled me to even consider fundraising and consider expanding, the business. And I don't know if I would have done that without Marc. He's got such a big swinging attitude. He always pushes other people to think bigger. And to put all their chips, put all their cards on the table, put all their chips in, and not doubt yourself. I think he has like an amazing sense of self-belief, and he's just a master at what he does. He understands what drives investor psychology, PR psychology, customer psychology. Like he just understands those things so intimately and can execute on those insights. And Hypercard is the greatest amalgamation. Right? It's the greatest combo of all these different things that he's good at, which is big partnerships, big flashy partnerships, big flashy investors, and branding that excites across all the stakeholders. I just think he's nailed it there.
I agree with you. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges you have as a young entrepreneur is just putting yourself out there. And what you notice is like when you're pitching to, say, important people, important companies, high stakes meetings, you want to be like, I feel like people are usually very humble with their like achievements or their track record. And it's like, oh man, like I don't want to come off as arrogant or cocky to these people. But the more I see this, the more I realize that you actually should be more cocky. You should be more like forward with the things that you've done, and they take you more seriously because of it. I think that like I saw this Gary Tan tweet which was essentially like, you go to these dinners and you ask people what they do, and they give you like a very humble thing, like as to like, oh, this is what we're working on or whatever, and you don't really get a sense of what their drive is, right? And I think that's something that you have. I think that's something that Marc has, which is like this unapologetic, almost just demeanor, which is like this is who I am. This is why it's going to be a massive company. And like, either bet on me or bet against me, but like, don't waste my time.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that actually
Yeah.
goes a long way. And most people don't think like that or don't operate that way.
I don't know if it can be. I feel like it can be learned, but some part of it is just right in the person.
For sure.
There are other levers. There are other levers to pull, but I think there is a fine line though between being like delusional and cocky as a young founder and coming off as I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. Nobody wants to like be around you. Nobody wants to meet with you because it's clear you're just super whack, right?
Yeah.
So I think there has to be like, there really does have to be a good idea at play and some traction there, right? Before you can go around and start talking that game, right? There needs to be like something underlying.
Well, to some extent, you're playing a character of sorts, right? You're playing a specific kind of character for your investor. You're playing a specific kind of character for your customers. And then you're playing a different kind of character in real life and how you act with your friends, right? Marc, as in the relationship we have as his friends, is probably very different than the Marc we see in the business world and how he's pitching his investors. And I've gotten to know the softer side of Marc, which is like just a really like nice, caring guy, right? And
Really
you may not see that when in the more like bold, audacious Marc. And I think that's part of it too, is like knowing when to turn that switch on and off is also so important. You can't be a hardo all the time, but there are specific times where you can use it as a strategic advantage. And I think that's when it's so important to know your customer and know who you're talking to.
The superpower isn't the superpower. The superpower is being able to control the superpower.
There you go.
And unleash that dog in you when it counts in the boardroom. But when you're out, make sure people can get behind you and actually enjoy your presence.
Let's go ahead and move on to our next story. So next, we're covering these two guys in their mid-20s. Their names are Shubh Sinha and John Kuhn. They're building the railroads of healthcare data with their company Integral. And I think if they get it right, it's going to make them billionaires. So here's a little bit on how it works. So in healthcare, you have this thing called HIPAA. It's essentially a law that prohibits doctors or hospitals from sharing your data without your permission. But if you work at a health tech company or an insurance company or in a pharma company, you may need some high-level data on things like consumer attributes or patient attributes in this case. So like their race, their income, where do they live? And usually you would use that info to guide things like vaccine deployment or where you're budgeting your spend at. But the challenge is that you can't buy that data unless you get HIPAA compliance approval first. And usually big firms like Deloitte and PwC are in charge of that process. So what ends up happening is that those firms end up running their own privacy models and analysis on this data. And by the time they scrub it, the data is no longer really valuable, right? Like they've essentially, like it's almost overprotective to the point where like it's not really usable. And so it becomes this really interesting thing where, you know, these healthcare companies are like, well, it's better than nothing. And so they end up using it. And so what John and Shubh have figured out with their company is they built a software that essentially runs every HIPAA compliant version of that data set. So a healthcare company can go in and pick and choose whichever data set is most useful for them. So not only do they speed up the process, but they give you a bunch of different versions. So you have more options as the healthcare provider or the buyer in this case.
I feel like if you can build a company that removes a team of consultants in any industry or category, you've won already, right? Like I'm investing. Guilty as charged. $10,000. I don't know. I think he found a magnificent gleaming problem, and he did it working in, I think, the advertising space when he had clients that were in the pharma category. So it's one of those examples of a guy that was working in a exciting company with a lot of growth and just identified a great business idea through just the clientele that he was working with. So that's just dope, right? What a really, really, really good problem. Yeah, dude, I feel like data has always been super valuable, but now with that being the raw ingredients for these algorithms and such, the processing of said data is becoming almost as valuable as having the data itself. Or in that what's the point of like building like don't even build a front end, right? Don't like just be the data provider. I feel like that's something we learned from a recent conversation we had with a VC who had telling us about this travel app that he was advising, travel software application. But yeah, I mean, it's just like filtering it out. It's almost like purifying it. And that's
Yeah,
what
it's the
Shubh
same
is
thing.
doing.
It's the infrastructure thing, right? Like you don't want to be on the marketing game. You don't want to be the person having to get people to use the data. You just want to make the data better so it is
Well,
usable.
yeah, it's like refining. It's like oil.
Exactly.
It's like Rockefeller, railroads of data, right? Oil refinery of medical data. I think it's amazing.
Yeah. So, I think you pointed to the story a little bit, but the origin for this is actually Shubh was working at a company called LiveRamp, and it's a multi-billion-dollar ad tech data company. And funny enough, healthcare is actually one of their smallest divisions. Like they actually work with like massive consumer brands and things like that. So I think it is a little bit of just like serendipity and luck at its, playing into itself again. Where Shubh was essentially like the PM and he was like the product lead of sorts on this specific initiative. So he was working with all these big pharma companies and he's like coming across this problem because the consultants were just super slow. Like they'd be waiting he'd be waiting forever trying to get this data back, right? And then he would give it to their clients and they'd be like, all right, well, what is this? Like, we can't even do anything with this. And he's like, guys, like, what can I do? Like my hands are tied here. And so, he essentially went to LiveRamp and he's like, listen, I think there's an opportunity here. Like, why don't we just create some kind of software that, can build out these models and we can be, this compliance person where we figure out what is HIPAA compliant and then we can just offer it to our clients. And they were like, yeah, no, like it just doesn't make sense for us. And he's like, well, can I run with it? And they're like, yeah, sure, if you want to. And so he leaves the company and ends up getting them as a client. So LiveRamp,
that's the goated path.
Yeah,
that's
LiveRamp ends up being a customer. And I thought that was great. And then, John, also great, super smart guy. These guys had actually met at Purdue where they went to school. And I think it's so funny. They were arguing about Steve Jobs in a programming language in class, and they had gotten called out by their professor in like this 400-person seminar. And that was like the start of their friendship. So he brought his boy like John back in the fold.
That's like the nerdiest story ever. Arguing about Steve Jobs in a programming language. How about that's like how not to get a girlfriend 101.
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny. And now like they have a great friendship and I think they're building a really cool company. So
do you know how much revenue
props to them. Huh?
How much revenue are they doing?
I know they're in the 7 figures. I don't know the exact amount.
Well, that's impressive because he started only like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, they're super early for sure.
Yeah. And they've raised a decent amount of money, like 6 million, right?
6 to 7 million. Haystack is like one of their lead investors. But, I think it's so interesting because I also worked at Eli.
Wait. When are you going to disclose your conflict of interest here? Because I heard you're a shareholder in this company.
I was getting to that. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny for sure. But I have a lot of belief in this, guys. And when Shubh first told me about the idea, I was like, I don't quite understand this, but I'm going to invest in you because I know you're just a beast and you'll figure it out. So I ended up putting in a small check. When it was so funny when they were telling me, it was like, okay, I hear healthcare and I hear data. I know if you figure out some way to do both of those things, you will be very rich. And I want to be on that ride with you.
Yeah.
Now I actually understand the company and it's like, oh, wow, this is a huge problem. Like, why is no one talking to this?
Healthcare and data is like the startup equivalent of like candle, roses, hotel. Something good's going to happen when you hear those things.
For sure. What's interesting is when I was working at Lilly, there were these 2 companies. It was called Symphony and IQVIA. And they were like the big software providers. They just had so much data on like pharmacy claims. And you even got it to like the week level, right? So if it was like a Lilly drug, for example, like Trulicity, right? You could see how much Trulicity was sold against like everybody else in the competitive landscape. And this software
data provider,
but it was also like a visualization platform as well. Like you could see how many prescriptions were going out and they had a digital and a print version. where they had like this massive report that you could read. And I remember them paying so much money to use that software. Like, I think even for the smaller like healthcare companies, they were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is like startup level. I can only imagine what they were charging like the big pharma companies at the time.
Yeah, man, being a data provider is just amazing, right? Like it's like all you have to do is sell information. Like that's the product. If you can find a way to like capitalize, like create a source for it. In this case, they're not even creating the data, they're just processing it, which I really, really like that model. I think data anonymization is going to be a really big category going forward with these AI models. I think, particularly in healthcare, when people are now looking at their data as their most valuable asset. I mean, they always have, but now it's becoming really important, right? Like, look at the New York Times suing OpenAI, right? Your information is your key to your own AI model now, right? Like, your key is that's your ticket to an AGI for your business. So companies are paying very special attention to the quality of those ingredients. It's like, okay, like, I live in Austin. I go to Central Market. I consume whole foods. I don't touch honey from from Kroger, whatever it is. It's almost like with AI models, they got to eat right. And if you can deliver healthy food to these hungry little growing monsters, right, you can be very valuable to the company building those monsters.
I think anonymization is an interesting point here, because I also believe like healthcare is going to become more and more personalized as we keep going. Like, there's so many of these health tech companies, there's so many of these apps, whatever, and there's just data being spread everywhere. But if you think about it, like, the needs of 50-year-old farmer Joe living in Indiana are very different than, like the affluent young woman working in banking in New York City, right? And I think typically when you think about standard of care, like, these healthcare companies just have to like think about them in blocks of sorts, right? Like, they reach like almost a barrier and they can't get more specific than that. And I think they're going to find really unique ways to improve that standard of care based on who it is they're targeting and what they actually need. So I'm interested to see how this evolves. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that those people have very different needs, and it's very top of mind for these companies.
I think if one thing were to go wrong, it would be something regulatory, like it
For
gets
sure.
even stricter as, like, for example, the US follows in GDPR's footsteps. Or it's like they get bullied out of the market. Like, I just did a story for Our Future on Epic Systems, and Judy Faulkner, the billionaire who runs it from Wisconsin, she intentionally has designed it as a closed system so that it doesn't communicate with other software. And she has 2/3 of Americans' health records, right? So she is also trying to capitalize on this like data market and the kind of the AI angle to it that I read. And I just feel like some of these bigger players could totally box out Shubh's business if they decide to start offering this service, or if they decide to change the rules, because they run the game, right? So depending on what the rules are, or if companies build out their own internal tools, right? Because sure, you need to, this HIPAA compliance is important, but I don't know. I could see a side to it
Well,
where
you need that
they do
third
it
party
internally.
unbiased person, right? Like,
Oh, okay.
because if you think about it, like, at the end of the day, the consulting firms are still in charge of compliance approval here, right? Like, they still have to make sure that, like, you're not getting, very intrusive data, and they're going to be the
Right.
ones who say yes or no. So they're not going to let the companies dictate that with their own models. Like, the incentives just don't make sense. The consulting firm does not give a shit whether this helps the healthcare companies or not. They're just trying to cover their own ass. What they don't want is that Wall Street Journal article that comes out where it says, oh, Deloitte, there was a data privacy leak, and this ended up being like this huge disaster where all this patient data got exposed. So like, there's no advantage for them to help out. Now, if Shubh can come in and say, hey, here are 10 different versions of this data set, all of them are HIPAA compliant, and like, choose whichever one you like. Like, we're not even going to be the ones to tell you, you only have to use this version. I think that's like pretty compelling for most healthcare companies. It's like, all right, well, again, better than nothing. And I think that also is an interesting point of like trying to build companies where the current solution is, damn, well, it's better than nothing, so I guess we should use it. Because it's like they're using it out of necessity rather than, need or want.
Yeah, true. I mean, Compliance just seems like such a great space to be in, no matter what, right? Because it has to be done. So there's probably a better way that compliance can be done in a lot of different industries. So I feel like that's just a framework that a lot of young entrepreneurs can take away from the conversation. Another cool thing about Shubh's strategy was they got the guy who wrote the law, specifically forcing healthcare companies to comply with this certain kind of data scrubbing practice. It's almost like you're building like an equality company and you're like, bitch, we got Thomas Jefferson right here. So yeah, they've got the guy to know the space and to help them young guns kind of become real and respected.
Well, sometimes, yeah. I mean, it's like you want to be the young trailblazer, but there's a lot of value in having the grown up in the room sometimes, especially with these people who are just naturally skeptic. They're so academia focused. They're focused on their PhDs and they're like, well, what did you contribute to X, Y, or Z? And it's like, listen, we got literally like the guy who sponsored this legislation or like was at least a big proponent for it in the room with us. Like he is by our side and like recognizes the value in what we're doing. It's like, it's definitely one way to build legitimacy around your company and yourself.
Dude, if there's one takeaway from this conversation to me, it's just how valuable relationships are to young entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Unless you're like Zuck and you code something up yourself that gets 100 million users without any money raised, probably don't need an adult to tell you what to do. But if you're doing any other kind of business, you need to be able to get these stakeholders who are much older and sophisticated to believe in you. And that's not an easy thing to do all the time, you know?
I think
really
the difference
is the ingredient.
too is like where you're selling into. So I think that Zuck analogy makes a ton of sense when you're building something consumer focused, like consumer social or whatever. But I think anytime you're selling into businesses, you're going to run into those barriers. And that's when it could make sense to bring in someone
you need
who
your
is
like
tenured.
Sam Ratner.
Totally.
Sam Ratner's boy, right? The guy who worked with all the gaming commissions and stuff.
Yeah.
Look, nobody knows what consumers want, right? But there's people who know what businesses want, and you got to get those people on your side.
Totally. All right. Yeah, I think on that, let's wrap. Thank you all for listening to another episode of Our Future Podcast. Appreciate you guys tuning in to me and Michael every single week. We love doing this. Please give us a rating and subscribe wherever you listen to this. And we will catch you again next week with another episode of Our Future Podcast. Stay frosty.
Stay frosty, everybody. Peace.